So, good evening, my friends from IBPC and our dear guests. Welcome to IBPC's new episode of a webinar by an inspiring personality this evening. IBPC has been operating for 20 years under the patronage of the Embassy of India, Kuwait, and the sitting ambassador is always its chief patron. IBPC's objective to connect the community together through professional speakers, cultural events, and other platforms of socializing are taking a break at the moment, and hence the alternate route of using virtual platforms. As an office bearer for 6 years now, my own journey has been one of exploration where so much learning has happened, all thanks to the community for giving me this opportunity to serve them. Quite frankly, I feel really sad that this pandemic has disturbed the norms of society we all took for granted. In any case, we have to hope and pray for the normal days as we are used to. Through this message, I strongly urge young professionals, entrepreneurs, and business families to come forth to be an active part of IBPC Executive Committee and bring positive changes in years to come. Also, I call upon all our members to ask people in your network to become members. And now, allow me to introduce this evening's keynote speaker. So, Mr. Shivshankar Menon is currently a professor at Ashoka University, New Delhi, and chair of the Ashoka Center for China Studies. He was previously National Security Advisor to the then Prime Minister of India, Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee, from January 2010 till May 2014. Foreign Secretary of India from October 2006 till July 2009, and has served as the Indian Ambassador or High Commissioner to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. To mention some of his credible associations and achievements, Mr. Menon joined the Brookings Institution, USA as a Distinguished Fellow. He serves as the Chairman, Advisory Board, Institute of Chinese Studies based in New Delhi. He is a Distinguished Fellow of the Center for Social and Economic Progress in India. He is a Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore. He is a member Board of Trustees, International Crisis Group, and he is a Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute, New York. A major milestone of Mr. Menon's career was the Indo-Us nuclear deal, for which he had worked hard to convince NSG member nations, along with Mr. Shyam Saran, to get a clean waiver for nuclear supplies to India. In 2016, he published his first book, Choices Inside the Making of Indian Foreign Policy, and very recently, yet another book, India and Asian Geopolitics, the Past, Present, which was released early this month. So I urge everybody to go grab a copy and read up on Mr. Menon's thoughts. He has also been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, and a Richard Wilhelm Fellow at MIT in 2015. He was chosen one of the top 100 global thinkers by the Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. Friends, let us give our ears to Mr. Menon for the next 30 minutes, which will be followed by a question and answer session. Thank you all. Have a good evening. And now I pass the stage to Mr. Menon.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Lamba. Thank you for that very flattering introduction and for mentioning my book, the new book. Thank you. That was good of you. Thank you for asking me actually to speak to you, to your group, about India-China relations and their future. It's an honor to be with you, even though virtually. What I thought I'd do in the next 30 minutes was to say what has happened recently. Don't worry, I won't go into the whole history from 1947 onwards about India-China relations, and then to say where we might be going, where we might take this, but to concentrate on what's the economic future between the two countries. So let me start. I mean, India-China relations today are in crisis. I think that's clear. We all know what happened on the border last year, since spring 2020, when the Chinese attempted to change the status quo along the line of actual control in the western sector in Ladakh. But frankly, that crisis has been building for some time, with stresses accumulating in the relationship since about 2012 or so. Before that, in 1988, we had formalized a basic understanding, a sort of modus vivendi, during the Rajiv Gandhi visit to China between him and Deng Xiaoping, the previous leader of China, in 88, which was that we will discuss our difficult issues and the differences, like the boundary question, which is the world's largest boundary dispute, and settle them peacefully. We would, in the meantime, maintain the peace on the border, and we would develop the rest of the relationship, trade, travel, etc., and cooperate on the international stage where we could, where our interests were the same. And that led to a series of agreements. 1993, we signed a Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, which committed both sides to respecting the status quo, not changing the situation militarily or doing anything to, and keeping the peace. And basically that understanding worked for the next almost 30 years. The border stayed as it was. The line of actual control didn't move, didn't shift sides. Both sides built up infrastructure on their own sides. Trade grew from something like 2 billion, well, from actually $200 million or so in 88, when Rajiv Gandhi visited, until almost 100 billion in 2019. 18, over 24,000 Indian students were studying in China in 2019. But all that has changed now, because from that position of coexistence, engagement, in 1988, we've now seen a big change in Chinese behavior on the line. The entire LAC is now live, the entire border. Why is this so? You know, you can produce local military reasons, tactical advantage. We built a road, they want to dominate it, and so on. But that doesn't explain tearing up something that kept the peace and enabled each side to go along with their more important business elsewhere for 30 years. For me, the fundamental reason is because the relative balance of power between India and China shifted. In the 1980s, and certainly during the Rajiv Gandhi visit, our two economies were roughly the same size. We were at similar technological levels. If anything, the Indian economy was more integrated into the world economy than China's. China had just begun reform, as had India. Today, after 40 years of reform and export-led growth, the Chinese economy is about 4 times larger than India's. Most global supply and value chains run through China. China is the world's manufacturing superpower. China is the world's greatest trader, and China is poised to be a technological innovator as well. And India-China relations have deteriorated steadily since about 2012. The signs of stress were evident. Border incidents became more frequent, larger in scope. Depsang in 2013, Chumar in 2014 when Xi Jinping was visiting India, Doklam, which was Bhutanese territory where the Chinese came and sat. In 2017, we had a 72-day face-off. And finally, what happened last year. And each one was larger, took longer, was harder to resolve. China abandoned her public neutrality on India-Pakistan issues and committed to building the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor on Indian territory under Pakistani control in Kashmir. Created a Chinese stake in a continuing Pakistani hold. And you saw the difference. In 2008, when we went to the NSG for a clean exemption, China went along with the consensus. In 2015, when we went to the NSG for membership of the NSG, the Chinese made it clear even before the meeting in public that they would oppose this, that they wanted criteria which would also allow their friend Pakistan in and so on. China is much more involved in the internal politics of our neighbors. If you look at commitments since 2016 to BRI projects just in South Asia, China has committed over $100 billion. In that period, since 2016 to now, India has invested about $800 million in the same neighbors. China has her complaints, by the way. India was the first and the only country to respond negatively to Xi Jinping's signature Belt and Road Initiative. As US-China relations got worse, deteriorated in the last decade, India's ties with the US strengthened, particularly in defense. We revived the Quad, we committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific, concepts that China regards with suspicion as trying to contain her. And we sought to rectify the adverse balance of power on the border from the beginning of the century by building new roads, advanced landing grounds, airfields, raising 2 new mountain divisions in 2010, raising a new mountain strike corps in 2013, and a host of other steps. Which brings us to the present crisis. Judging by what the PLA did and their bringing in of major forces, the Chinese are in this now for the long haul. They have tried for some years to freeze present Indian force levels on both sides. They tried to suggest it in negotiations because the present asymmetry is in China's favor. Not overwhelmingly so, nothing like the economic imbalance, but certainly they've used that asymmetry to try and change the situation along the LAC. And in some areas like Depsang, Gogra Hot Springs, we still have to get them to vacate where they've moved forward. In Pangong, we did the same to them, and then finally we have now restored very much the status quo that existed before. But the difference is this time around, unlike previous face-offs, Chinese now present this as a sovereignty dispute. In the past, the Chinese line used to be the whole boundary is disputed. As long as they call it disputed, that means that it is negotiable. It takes give and take, mutual adjustment to settle. Once it becomes a sovereignty issue, then it becomes territorial integrity of the state, then it becomes much harder to settle. And it suggests that, frankly, this time for China, the issue is not just about the LAC or its clarification, but is part of a much larger exercise and is part of a bigger Chinese conviction about the nature of the relationship. And frankly, for me, this is a bit worrying because, you know, Prime Minister Modi has met with Xi Jinping 18 times since 2014, since he came to power. And the Modi government has been quite careful in its dealings with China. But I think China operates on her perception of the relative balance of power. You see this both in history, you see it in the way she deals with the US, until 2008, when she was convinced that this was a unipolar world, that the US was the sole superpower, China went along with most of what the US did. Since the global financial crisis in 2008, she was convinced that the US, the West, was in terminal decline, and she's become much more assertive across the board. Vis-a-vis India, therefore, what we have seen last year is a fundamental shift in Chinese policy. And it seems to me that this is based on a new calculation. Since about 2 years ago, the Chinese have started saying that India is no longer non-aligned. India is now effectively an ally of the US. So that the one restraint on their behavior, which was that if they pushed India too hard, India would become an ally of their major adversary, the US, that restraint no longer operated from about 2 years ago. And they decided to push on the border for various reasons, I think, for larger strategic reasons, because this is not some local military decision. And I think this is because China herself sees the world now as much more hostile. We have heard Xi Jinping's statements over the last year or so, saying that while the situation is still good for China to realize the China dream, but the world situation is getting much more complicated. US is pushing back. China's neighbors, maritime neighbors at least, all the way from India to Japan, are working together in defense, security, intelligence, and so on. And so China has become much more assertive. You've seen it in the East China Sea, on the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands with Japan, on Taiwan, you've seen it in Hong Kong, you've seen it in the South China Sea, you've seen it on our border as well. So where do we go from here? What will happen to India-China relations? I think it's clear that on the border itself, the Chinese seem relatively happy with the status quo, new status quo that they have created. So they say, now let's go back to business as usual, don't make the border, everything dependent on the border, etc. Whether we can accept it, I don't think it's a very good idea, because to appease that kind of use of force to try and change the status quo and tearing up all the agreements that they had respected before for about 30 years, I don't think that's a very good lesson to teach them, because it would teach them, it will only feed their appetite to do more and to keep changing things in their favor, to do what they've done in the South China Sea, which is a form of salami slicing, taking it bit by bit, but staying below the threshold which would provoke a full-fledged conventional response and conflict. In any case, now the border, the LAC, has been militarized and called into question all along the line and is now live. And this is a new military reality that we will have to deal with. So India-China relations as a whole have therefore been reset to a new normal. There's no going back to what they were, to the surface calm that prevailed before 2020 or to coexistence that existed before 2012. Political relations will now be much more adversarial, antagonistic, contentious. Although theoretically you could work out some new modus vivendi, but frankly that is unlikely to my mind. Clearly the impact on Indian public opinion of what happened was very, very negative. Polls towards in autumn last year showed that 84% of Indians believe that Xi Jinping has betrayed Modi, and 91% believe that the banning of Chinese apps, denying contracts to Chinese companies were the right approach. But the question is really, can we decouple from China? To my mind, there are limits to decoupling. China accounted for about 12% of India's imports in 2019, when total two-way trade was around $92.68 billion. $56 billion in China's favor. I mean, look at that imbalance. China was India's largest trading partner until it was overtaken by the US in 2019. But even after what happened on the border in spring 2020, China overtook the US in 2020 to become India's largest trading partner again. We have to see really, can we decouple? Frankly, in 2020, our trade with the whole world fell, but trade with China fell less than our trade with the rest of the world. So China's proportion in our trade actually went up in 2020, despite what happened. Our exports grew. I mean, iron ore exports to China grew by 88%, marine products did well. And China's share in our imports grew from less than 14% in the year ending March 2020 to almost 19% in April, December 2020. And that's share of China's share in our import basket has only grown even further. So, and when you look at manufacturing, as I said, in 1990, the Indian and Chinese manufacturing sectors were roughly comparable. Today, their manufacturing sector is about 10 times larger. And it's 27.2% of China's economy, which is itself, as I said, 4.8 times larger than India's. In India, manufacturing is only about 13.7% of our total economy in terms of composition. In 1990, we were ahead in terms of capital goods, in terms of machinery production, but now China's capital goods sector is about 50 times larger. So frankly, what's happened now is that there is a concentration of economic power in China. The advanced economies the OECD economies accounted for about 90% of global manufacturing in 1990. Today, their share is around 60%. China is near 20% of global. India, 2.8%. So, and our dependence on China has grown, not just in important sectors, but also in terms of investment in technology, fintech, both the technology and the investment, pharmaceuticals, 68% of our APIs, auto parts, electronics, telecom. China accounts for over 50% of Indian imports in 86 tariff lines, according to the GOM, which studied this last year and produced a report in December. And is the largest source of critical inputs in telecom, power, electronics equipment, and others. And in the last 6 years, Chinese invested over $26 billion into India, most of it in startups, in tech, in telecom, in fintech. And a fair amount of that actually in the new Indian unicorns. Among the top 10 Indian tech unicorns valued at more than $1 billion, 7 are backed by Chinese investors. So we really now have economies which are intertwined. This doesn't mean that we have no leverage in this relationship. We can and have done something. I mean, the absence on is not really the major thing. But Chinese project exports to India are significant. And dealing with that, after all, our imports of Chinese telecom equipment per year are estimated something like 84,000 crores. And we have zero access to their telecom market. We can actually limit dependence on China in critical infrastructure, cyber, telecom, for instance. And of course, the ultimate answer is building our own manufacturing. But even in the short term, though China's exports to India-China trade constitute about 3% of China's exports to the world, we contribute 16% of China's overall global trade surplus. So we have the largest trade deficit actually with them after the US, Hong Kong, and the Netherlands. Hong Kong, of course, is part of China, closely followed by the UK. And this is significant leverage. The other point of leverage is access to the Indian data market. 5G is obviously an area. Can we use China-US rivalry? As soon as India banned Chinese apps, Google pledged $10 billion investment in India Digitization Fund. It then invested $4 billion in geo platforms. Facebook followed Google, investing $5.7 billion, and so on. So we've seen a sudden rise in US venture tech and investment in Indian tech as a result. But the Chinese are still there. In fact, there's fresh Chinese investment proposals all through 2012. The government of India announced in December that something like 12,000 crore rupees, about $1.64 billion US dollars worth of FDI proposals had been received from China after April, after the prior approval was imposed for all Chinese investments in India. So it seems to me that while we can lessen our dependence, while we can try and reshape the economic relationship and use what leverage we have, which I've just mentioned, to reshape that economic relationship, decoupling is not going to happen, even though the political relationship is going to be much more difficult. The other problem, frankly, and this is today, if you look at the Asian economy and global supply chains, they're all being restructured, but they're not necessarily being restructured away from China. In fact, much of the movement of production in garments and textiles out of China to Vietnam, to Bangladesh, is actually Chinese moving their production out as wages rise in China. So can India afford to stay away from the restructuring of the Asian economy and the global supply chains? We are already one of the least integrated major economies in the world. We are the only major economy which is not part of a regional trading bloc, and we've walked away from the RCEP. For the last 4 years, we've raised tariffs, import duties. And the risk is really that if Atmanirbharta becomes autarky, as we saw in the 60s and early 70s, frankly, then we run the real risk of missing the bus. So it seems to me that India-China economic relations can go in various directions. Much of it will depend on our own choices, on whether we're willing to go out and compete and engage, especially to our east, or not. But the primary focus of India-China contention in the future is, of course, going to be the subcontinent and the Indian Ocean region. We've seen the Chinese much more involved in our neighborhood. They've been in Nepal trying to keep the two Nepalese communist parties united so that Oli stays in power. We've seen their BRI commitments. I mentioned $100 billion since 2016. So we are now in a situation where we need to actually step up our game in the subcontinent itself. We do have several things in our favor: the affinities with our neighbors, location, proximity, and the fact that China's rise has provoked pushback not just from the US or from India, but from Japan, from Vietnam, from Indonesia, from other countries who also face this. So before I end, it seems we now have a very mixed and a much more complicated picture for the future of India-China relations. There is a natural tendency for people to say, oh, but we'll look for outside balancers. But nobody else has exactly the same interests in their relationships with China as you do. They might be unhappy with what China is doing, but ultimately your defense, your boundary, your disputes, you will have to be able to deal with yourself. It's an irony that people want an ally who can take care of himself, not a needy ally. Just like when you look for a partner, you look for somebody who brings something to the table, not somebody who comes and then relies on your strength to get his work done. So there is really no way around self-strengthening. We can do everything else, work with everyone else, work with the US, work with Japan, do the Quad, do everything else. But ultimately, I think we need not just to work with the others, but we do need fundamental reform. And a lot of that has already begun, whether it's military reform in India itself with the appointment of the CDS, theater commands, and so on. And as we do this, we will continue to get logically closer to the US because we share similar concerns. But in essence, we will be following the same policy of strategic autonomy that we have followed so far, because if you notice, when you look at the Quad, for instance, the other three are islands in a sense. They're behind oceans. We are the only ones who are both a maritime power and a continental power. And our real problem with China is on land, is on the continent. And the others don't share those interests. They help us to contain China at sea, to keep the sea lanes open, which are critical for our survival. But they don't solve all our security problems with China. So we have this much more complicated picture for the future of the relationship. It's going to take a lot more skill. It's going to be hard to manage. But the prospect is not that negative. I would keep saying this over and over again. We have strengths which we never had before. We have leverage in the relationship. And we do have an external environment which is not necessarily entirely negative. All policy is a bet on the future. We've already made our bet on a multipolar Asia, on the fact that Asia will stay open. It won't end up totally tied to the apron strings of any one power, whether it's China, the US, or anyone else. And leaving RCP was one such bet. Now let's see. Only the future will tell whether that bet was right. I'll stop there, and I'd be very happy to answer questions and to hear what you think about this.
Thank you, Mr. Menon. That was really wonderful. The way you have, sort of connected all the various dots that China and India shares. And yes, it is a rather complicated relationship, and maintaining an equilibrium is not easy. We have one, let me open, and we have a question from one Mr. Ramesh Khanna, dear friend. Dear Mr. Menon, do you believe US will be able to contain expansionist plans of China in the distant future? I hope your forecast will be as good as yours on Tiananmen Square.
I think I'm not sure whether the US will be able to contain China or not. Because the US has a mixed relationship with China, like us. I mean, they are codependent economically. Don't forget, they're their biggest trading partner. They depend on each other. I mean, for Apple, 24% of her profits depend on China. For US Aerospace, Boeing, for instance, even DuPont, chemical company, 9% of their profits come from China. These are codependent. This is not like China, like the Soviet Union and the US in the Cold War, who ran two separate worlds. So I think, they will contain, but they will also cooperate on things like climate change, and they will find economic common ground, and ultimately they will have common ground against allowing anybody else to rise. We must remember that also. Beyond a certain point, nobody wants to allow anybody else near them. So I'm not counting on the US to contain China. But what I do think is that China's trajectory is much more difficult than previous global hegemons, say Great Britain, US, and so on, for three big reasons. One is demography. They already have an aging population. By 2040, they'll be the same age structure as Japan is today. And they will have to, and they'll have all the things that go with that. The economy will revert to mean, which means back to, many people think it's already running at about 2.5%, even before COVID, even though they say 6%. Secondly, she's in a very crowded neighborhood. She doesn't have the option that the US, Britain, all of them have to be offshore balancers, to intervene when it suits them and go home when it doesn't. To get into the world war, fight the war, win, whatever, fix it, go away, and then manage things at home. China doesn't have that option. She has 14 neighbors and she has difficult relations with almost all of them. Even her present best friend, Russia, who's been pushed into her arms by the West, has always had a complicated relationship with China, but with Japan, with Vietnam, with us, you name it. She's in a crowded neighborhood where other countries are rising too. Korea, Japan, India, these are not small countries. So it's not as though China is going to have her way easily. Thirdly, China today is a global economic power. She's an economic superpower. But in military terms, only the US can project military force around the world. And this was true in 1991, as you saw in Kuwait, but it's true everywhere, even today. China is a regional military power today. In her neighborhood, she's very powerful. But even there, she doesn't always get her way 100%, as we saw on our own border last year. Yes, we had to struggle, we had to pull up our stocks, etc., but we did manage to hold them and then actually to get them to vacate in North Upango. And most important of all, so apart from pushback, crowded neighborhood, economy reverting to mean, demography, it's a complicated society today, China. China today spends more on internal security than she does on national defense. She spends more on the police than she does on the army. That tells you something. I mean, what is all the surveillance state for? Facial recognition, to do a social credit system where if you cross the road wrong, they will then deduct some points from your social credit account. What does that mean? It means 100% surveillance, the capacity to process all that data. But why? What is making you so nervous that you have to watch everything all the time and spend so much on building up the state? It's very hard to believe that this is a normal state. I often say that if you want to know where a society is going to be in 10, 20 years, read their science fiction. And Chinese science fiction is fantastic, but it's also frightening. It's like US science fiction in the 50s and 60s. Remember, I told you all about satellite communications, All the things we take for granted now, the internet, everything was in US science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke and Asimov in the 50s and 60s. Read Chinese science fiction today and you get a very frightening. So for me, China's trajectory is what's going to determine this future more than what other people do. Yes, what other people do matters, and it'll matter to us, of course. But ultimately, I think, and China is an internally driven society. So I think this is, it's something that's true of many great powers, that of China has that. The US is also internally driven. I mean, we don't determine when the US, changes policy, and let's be clear on that. So, but I think that's part of the problem. Luttwak says that China, like the US, has great power autism. Because they are so different and so unique, they don't understand other people. When the Chinese Politburo decided to attack India in 1962, Mao Zedong told them, don't worry, we'll attack them, we'll defeat them, and then in 30 years, we'll be friends again. And don't forget what they did with the Americans. They fought the Korean War with them. Mao Zedong lost his own son in the Korean War. He died there in Korea. And within 20 years, he makes peace with Nixon and Kissinger and forms an alliance against the Soviet Union. That might be Chinese psychology. It's not Indian psychology. After 62, we still carry the scars today. So there is this lack of understanding of the way the world works. You see it in their diplomacy. They're not making many friends. In fact, they're less. So there is a problem there. And so for me, this is a fascinating thing. How far will power take them? And how far will all these other factors actually limit the power or actually stop its effect on the rest of the world and us?
Wow.
Sorry, long answer, but it's because this is the key question,
It is. It's very, very, very nicely explained, even with all those various, again, nuances operating in that area. So we have another question is from our friend Kaiser. He asks, have we accepted a new status quo with China at the border? So do we move from there?
I hope not.
I hope not.
I think that's really dangerous because, appeasement never works, especially with aggressors, with people who are trying to change things, who are using force to change things. You just feed their appetite. My fear, I've said this before, is that we may have taught the Chinese the wrong lesson by mistake, without meaning to, in the past. After Doklam, for instance, we negotiated withdrawal from the face-off site, and that the Chinese respected. They moved away from the place where we had the face-off in Doklam. But what did they do after that? They came in and occupied the rest of the plateau, built 3 helipads, 4 tarred roads, 36 huts, and they now sit on the plateau where they used to come twice a year and drink a cup of tea and go away, just to show presence. But since 2017, they're actually on the plateau. But the face-off site is clear. So they've respected the letter of the agreement. So, and I think that was a mistake because, we declared victory after 2017, said we faced them down, they've gone away. But then they thought they can get away with this.
Right.
And this is a dangerous lesson. So if we accept the status quo, this changed status quo that they've created in areas like Depsang and so on, then frankly, I think then actually we face an even more dangerous future.
Right. Another question is, sir, in your opinion, how China has been able to get away so lightly, even after spreading COVID across the world, causing so many deaths and economic destruction? So that's a question even I have.
This you have to leave to karma and God. I mean, human beings don't operate on the basis of justice. I'm afraid the international system is an anarchic, amoral system. That's the world we live in. It always has been, it always will be. And it's a system that at least the realists will tell you is based on power. If you have the power, might is right. The strong do what they will, the weak do what they must, is the sort of summary. So to expect that, if that somehow the karma will catch up with them, Maybe it will, maybe it does, I don't know. But it's not the international system that's going to enforce it.
True.
Sorry to be cynical, but
no, it's fine. I have a question on the industrialization of India. So our family has been in business for many years, and we have dealt with a lot of industrial products out of India. And also, unfortunately, we have to buy from China. So, point being made is, India's industrialization has not progressed at the speed what China has been able to do, right? And we all know that. What do you think should Indian government or Indian administration should be providing? What kind of platform should they be providing so that, seriously, India has the brains. We have the know-how, we have the ability, we have the will.
Everything.
People, entrepreneurship in India is outstanding. Indian entrepreneurs are everywhere globally. Okay. In fact, they seem to be more prominent than the Chinese on the global platform.
Yeah.
So what can India give or provide to our Indians so where they can actually really go at full speed in industrializing India? That to me, I think, is one of the strongest.
You get many explanations for this. I mean, I remember Vajpayee once asked, I remember, China ne itna chalang kaise mara? What a lovely word, ne? Chalang. It's so true. And you get thousands of explanations. I mean, there's some really good explanations. Mine is very simple. Deng Xiaoping concentrated on making factor costs low. Capital, he provided cheap. Rates of interest, he kept them below 2% for that entire period. Even now, I mean, in China, they're still below 3%. Land is state-owned and made available for industry, and industry gets priority. Labor, cheap. There's a huge surplus labor pool in the villages which they tapped into. Now they're getting to the end of it, and wages are rising. But so you keep money, you keep land, you keep labor, you keep the basic factors of production cheap. The rest of it takes care of itself. The rest is management. And that I'm sure we can do. That's not, but unless government concentrates on the basic factors of production. I mean, why did Japan keep interest rates, keep the yen low, keep interest rates low for that entire period, right through the 60s, 70s? You can be accused of being currency manipulator, whatever, by the US, but the fact is that works. And unless you're competitive, and how else do you create competitiveness? When it's not your technology, when it's not, so for me, this is the basis. The rest, I think, you'll get much more sophisticated. I'm no economist. I don't know these things very well. But it seems to me you have to get your hands on that. And that's where I think for us, land acquisition was very important, that we clean it up rather than run away from it.
True.
Bankruptcy is important. Why? Because it'll also make money cheaper. If you're carrying all these, the cost of your money actually is so high because of inflation and this on top of it. And so wages, frankly, we are cheap, but but we're unproductive. I mean, if you look at our productivity compared to Chinese productivity, and this is true throughout history. So you have to invest in those people. You have to educate them. You have to do what Mao did, which is liberate women, for instance, bring them into the workforce. And that meant a huge difference in Chinese productivity, in labor productivity. But so for me, go back to the basics. That's my answer, but I don't know. What do you think? You know more than I do.
No, I agree with you on what you said, that get that basic factors right. Land, the land bank, the interest rates low,
money,
provide, the infrastructure like electricity supply, all those basic, keep that at the right level. And then you're right, the rest management will do. Whoever is the entrepreneur, he will see the opportunity and he will take it forward, or she will take it forward, for sure.
He'll find them.
Because in India, even today, entrepreneurs, with the difficult challenges that they face, they still make it happen.
Correct.
Imagine if they're giving favorable conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's very obvious. So one more question we have is from our friend again, Mr. Khanna. drawing from your talk, will it be advisable for India and China leave US out, join hands to become world powers, complement each other, and rule the world together?
Lee Kuan Yew used to say that if I were Chinese, I would be seeking primacy for myself.
Right.
Good luck to them. But if they do achieve primacy, good luck for us, because then we'd better watch out. So, nobody wants to share anything. And when you've achieved a certain level of power, established powers don't open the door and say, welcome, come to the Security Council, come, let's. Why? Nobody shares power willingly within domestic political systems or the international system. So, no, I don't think so. In fact, part of our problem with China is this conviction that's grown in the last 10 years that China is the only major power who explicitly doesn't like the rise of India. Because she sees an Asian rival, she doesn't like the idea. She thinks this is her Asia and ultimately her world. And India stands in the way. India, Japan, this is the problem.
Yeah, you're right about that. Nobody wants to share power. That is difficult. Yeah, that's, I think, a common human mentality world over.
Yeah, it doesn't change anyway.
Yeah. So I take one more question. And do you think we need a China-Mao-style revolution in India to progress?
I think China paid a huge price for what she did. She went through a famine which killed 40 million people after the Great Leap Forward. If you look at the Cultural Revolution, she wiped out a whole generation, 10 years of schooling gone. And ultimately, she had to turn to the rest of the world. Yes, there are things we should learn from China. For the last 40 years, China has been like a sponge, absorbing knowledge, technology, everything from anywhere in the world. Doesn't matter. They came to India to study the stock exchange, I remember, in 1990. They studied our civil service system. They came. So they were absorbing, just like a sponge, any kind of knowledge that would be useful. And then they took it and applied it at home. And I think we need to show a little of that open-mindedness. There's a lot we can learn that way from China. But we can't, I don't think we can replicate China's Cultural Revolution, China's land reform, which killed about 6 million people, at least in the first 3 years. No, I don't. We have a very different history, geography, society, everything very different from China. So, even historically, I mean, we keep saying, oh, China is 4 times bigger than us. The historical average has been China has been about 3 times bigger than our economy over history. If you look at Angus Madison's figures from the dawn of history. Together, we have accounted for a very large part of global manufacturing. About 2/3 of global manufacturing in 1750 was from India and China. And something like, even today, if you look at the shift in the last 20 years, 60% of global GDP is the US, China, and India. 3 countries. We are not a big share of global GDP. We are about 8%, a little bit more maybe. China is about 17, 18%. The US is about 25, 26%. We say today. But but post-COVID, suddenly now we've become the biggest contributors because everybody else is in real. So we have to see now which way this develops. Will the Chinese work with us? They see us as a competitor. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done what they did on the border. Part of the reason is to tie you up and to keep you busy. They wouldn't be committing so much to Pakistan either, or to your neighbors. They want to keep you engaged in the subcontinent and keep you busy in your own affairs. And they're quite happy to see you dividing yourself and fighting among yourselves and so on. So, no, I'm afraid if you want global domination, which frankly, for me, the goal of policy is to transform India, is to make Indians' lives better, right? Not to dominate the world or to get a Security Council seat or to be friends with somebody or somebody else telling me I'm wonderful. I'm not interested in status. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm not interested in glory. I want India to be a prosperous, secure country where every Indian can achieve his or her full potential. That's it. And if you keep your eye on that, then you stop worrying about these other things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that the last part you said, that let us focus on our own issues at home. Get our house in order, because that honestly, we still need to fix a lot of things at home.
You see, when the world thinks you are fixing your things, they treat you with respect, and they treat you very differently from the way they treat you otherwise. I mean, my 42 years in government, I saw as a diplomat. It's a huge difference, the way the world treats you, depending on whether they think you know what you're doing and whether you're heading in the right direction. It doesn't mean that you have to be a power yet, but they think you're going there. You'll make it.
Thank you so much, sir. One message is just to say that wish you a very long and happy life from somebody anonymous.
That's nice of you.
That has been a wonderful talk from you, sir. Very, very, sort of inspiring, and also educationist, in a way, so understanding the geopolitics of India and its neighbors. Yeah. So thank you. You have a good evening, sir. We really truly
enjoyed that. Thank you. Thank you very much. All the best.
Sir. All the best, sir. Thank you. All the best. God bless. Thank you.
All the best. Bye.